The instructions were simple enough that her mother had written them on a sticky note and pressed it to the dashboard before Wren even started the engine. Call the realtor when you get there. Take photos of every room. Don't touch anything you don't have to. Back by Friday. 4 lines, 22 words. That was the sum total of what Margaret Calloway had given her daughter for a 6-hour drive into the Allegheny Mountains to close out the last piece of a man Margaret hadn't spoken to properly in 20 years. Wren had peeled the note off the dashboard somewhere around Morgantown and put it in the cup holder face down, because looking at her mother's handwriting made something tighten in her chest that she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. She was 22 years old. She had dropped out of her 3rd year of environmental science at Penn State 4 months ago when her scholarship was cut and the math stopped working. And since then, she had been living in her mother's spare room in Pittsburgh, applying for jobs she didn't get, and feeling like a person who had been placed in a waiting room without being told what she was waiting for. This was not supposed to be an answer to that. This was supposed to be a chore. The drive changed character 3 or 4 times before it was done. The interstate bled into a state highway which thinned into a county road, which eventually became something that the state of West Virginia had apparently decided to call a road as a courtesy rather than a description. Single lane. Broken blacktop giving way to packed gravel, giving way to a surface that was more memory than pavement, climbing into the Alleghenies through tunnels of hemlock and red spruce that closed overhead and turned the afternoon light green and subaqueous. Wren cracked the window. The smell came in before anything else. Wet stone and balsam, and something underneath both of those things, a cold, high-altitude smell that had no name in the vocabulary she'd built in cities and classrooms, a smell that lived in places where the wind never fully stopped. Her body recognized it before her mind did. Something in her shoulders dropped a half-inch without her deciding to let it. She had been here once. She was 7 years old. Her mother had put her on a Greyhound bus with a sandwich and a note pinned to her jacket and told her that Grandpa Asa would be waiting at the other end, and he had been a tall man with white hair and a Forest Service patch on his shoulder, standing at the bus station with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting in high places for things that took a long time to arrive. He had not made a fuss. He had taken her bag, bought her a Coke from the machine, and driven her up the mountain without asking her a single question she didn't know how to answer. She had been there for 6 weeks. She remembered the smell of the wood stove and the sound of the wind on the tin roof, and the way the forest looked at dawn from somewhere very high up, green and endless, and absolutely indifferent to whether you were having a good day. She had not gone back. Her mother had not sent her back, and Wren had not asked to go because there were things between her mother and that mountain that no 7-year-old was equipped to understand, and by the time she was old enough to ask about them, the silence around the subject had calcified into something you didn't poke at. Asa Calloway had died 14 months ago on a cold morning in October, and Margaret had come for the funeral and stayed 2 nights in a motel by the interstate and come home looking like a woman who had locked a door she intended never to open again. She had inherited 11 acres and a cabin and a decommissioned fire tower, and she had done nothing about any of it for 14 months, and now she was sending her unemployed daughter to deal with it, because dealing with it herself was apparently not something Margaret Calloway was going to do. The road bent around a shoulder of gray rock. The trees fell away. Wren saw it. She saw the cabin first, a low, dark logged building, wedged into the saddle between the two summits of Saddle Knob, exactly as she had been told to expect. Tin roof the color of an old nickel, stone chimney leaning a few degrees off plumb, porch sagging at one end where a post had given way. The assessor's card, which Wren had found in her mother's files and read in the parking lot of a gas station in Elkins, had listed the structure's value as 0. Not low, 0. She had looked at that number for a long time before she put the card back. She understood the 0 when she saw the cabin. She would have understood the 0 with her eyes closed. But the cabin was not what stopped her breath. Behind it, rising out of the spruce canopy, with the unhurried authority of something that had been there since before the forest, was the Iron Giant. She had been told there was a fire tower. The realtor's listing had mentioned it in a single subordinate clause, decommissioned fire tower, as though it were an afterthought, a footnote, a minor feature slightly less significant than the gravel in the driveway. Nothing about that phrase had prepared her for what she was looking at. It was not a fire tower, or rather it was a fire tower now, in the way that a cathedral is sometimes a converted warehouse, technically accurate, fundamentally misleading about the nature of the thing. The Iron Giant was a military observation tower built in 1943, when the Army Corps of Engineers had decided that the summit of Saddle Knob was a strategically useful vantage point and had proceeded to make their opinion permanent in steel. It rose 140 feet from the ground, which put its glass cab level with the tops of the oldest spruce trees and considerably above most everything else in 4 counties. The steel was the deep, reddish-black of old iron that has been weathered for 80 years without ever quite succumbing, a color that was simultaneously the color of rust and the color of something very old and very strong that rust had not managed to defeat. At its base, running the perimeter of a concrete footer that the Army had poured in the summer of 1943, stood the original military fence. Concertina wire oxidized to a brownish orange, still coiled along the top rail of a chain-link section that had been there before Wren's mother was born. The gate was open, had probably been open for decades, but the fence itself was intact, and in the afternoon light it had a quality that was less agricultural and more archaeological. Something preserved, something that had been here long enough that the mountain had stopped trying to reclaim it and had simply incorporated it instead. The cab at the top of the tower, the small glass-walled room where a fire lookout would once have sat and scanned 100 square miles of forest for smoke, was the last thing you noticed, because it was the hardest thing to focus on from the ground. But when the angle was right and the afternoon light caught it, it flared briefly in the spruce canopy like a lit match, like a signal, like something that was specifically trying to be seen. Wren sat in the parked truck for a long time with the engine ticking as it cooled. The listing said decommissioned fire tower. The listing was wrong in a way that felt important. She got out. The air hit her face, cold and absolute, and the smell that had been coming in through the cracked window expanded into something that occupied her entire body, that high-altitude smell, that wind and stone. Smell. The smell that her muscles had apparently stored somewhere in the months she had been 7 years old and living on the side of a mountain. She crossed the dead grass toward the cabin without looking away from the iron giant. The way you can't quite look away from something very large when you're standing close to it. The front door was locked. She tried the 3 keys from the manila folder her mother had left on the kitchen counter in Pittsburgh one by one, until the 3rd. A long brass key worn smooth at the bow, the kind of smooth that comes from thousands of uses over decades, turned with a dry, reluctant complaint in the lock, and the door swung inward. The smell of the inside came out to meet her. Cold ash and cedar and dust, and something else underneath. Something that was not a smell so much as a quality of the air, the particular stillness of a room that has been holding its breath since the last person left. She stepped over the threshold and waited for her eyes to adjust. The cabin was one main room with a sleeping loft above, and a lean-to kitchen off the back, which was exactly what the floor plan she'd found online had suggested, and which told her nothing about the experience of standing inside it. The floor was wide pine boards worn pale at the centers, where feet had traveled the same paths for 40 years. A cast-iron wood stove occupied the center of the room on a hearth of flat creek stones. Its surface the deep gray of something that has been hot many thousands of times. A plank table stood against the window with 2 chairs, one of which had a leg mended with a wrap of baling wire so neat it was almost decorative. The walls were lined with shelves Asa had built himself, and the shelves held the ordinary archaeology of a life lived alone in a specific place. A coffee can of nails sorted by size. A kerosene lamp with a smoke-blackened chimney. A row of field guides with broken spines, their covers soft from decades of wet hands and field use. A transistor radio of a vintage suggesting it had been purchased before Wren's mother was in high school. A coil of rope hung on a peg beside a folded topographic map of Pendry County. On the peg by the door hung his coat, canvas, faded to the color of dust. A Forest Service patch on the left shoulder, the embroidery worn to almost nothing at the edges. The kind of garment that has been washed so many times in cold mountain water that it has lost everything that was ever decorative and become purely itself. Wren stood in front of it for a moment. Then, without deciding to, she pressed her face into it. He smelled of wood smoke and cold air, and something she didn't have a name for the particular smell of a person who has spent 40 years in the same place, doing the same work with the same quiet seriousness. She stood with her face in his dead coat for longer than made sense, and she did not cry because she had cried for this man exactly once at the funeral standing outside the Methodist church in the rain, while her mother stood with a straight back and dry eyes, and the expression of someone who had been practicing for this for 20 years. She pulled back. On the table, his enamel thermos and a tin cup, and beside them a block of basswood half-carved into the shape of a bird. The wings were roughed in. The breast was smooth. The tail was still raw wood waiting for a knife that was not coming back. He had been working on it the week he died, which was the kind of detail that sat on the chest like a stone once you knew it. Wren set the carving down carefully and looked around the room. On the kitchen shelf, 3 mugs lined up in a row. 3 mugs. One man living alone. She picked up the nearest one and turned it in her hands, looking at the two behind it, and filed the discrepancy away in the part of her mind that had been trained in 3 years of environmental science to notice when the number of things in a system doesn't match the number of organisms using the system. She took out her phone. She photographed the main room, the kitchen, the loft ladder, the front door. She did what her mother had sent her to do. Her thumb hovered over the realtor's contact, which Margaret had already added to Wren's phone, because Margaret was organized in the way of people who need very badly to get a thing done without having to think about it too long. She put the phone in her pocket. She went and stood at the window that looked out at the Iron Giant. It stood there in the last of the afternoon light, its steel the color of old blood in the specific way that only things exposed to high-altitude weather for decades ever achieve a richness almost. An investment of time made visible in the surface of a material. At its base, she could see the gate in the concertina wire fence. Open. Had been open a long time by the look of it. Above the fence, the tower's first landing 20 feet up was just visible through the framework of vertical girders and diagonal bracing, and above that, the second landing, and above that, the structure continuing upward in the same repeated geometry, growing smaller with distance, until the cab at the top was a smudge of glass in the late afternoon sky. She wanted to climb it. The thought arrived fully formed immediate with no preamble or negotiation. She had wanted to climb it the moment she saw it, and she had not yet examined why, but she thought it had something to do with the fact that she had spent 4 months in a spare room in Pittsburgh, feeling like a person whose life had been postponed, and the tower was the most unambiguous vertical object she had seen in a long time, and vertical in that moment felt like a direction she understood. Not tonight. The light was already going. She made coffee on the wood stove, using the percolator she found on a shelf in the kitchen, because making coffee was the thing you did in a strange place when you needed to give your hands a task. She carried the cup to the table and sat in the chair with the baling wire leg, which held solidly, suggesting the repair was better than it looked, and she sat in the near dark and drank the coffee and listened to the mountain. Night came to Saddle Knob the way it had come to her once before, when she was 7 years old and sleeping in the loft above this exact room. No orange glow on the horizon from distant streetlights. No traffic hum, no neighbor's television, no ambient urban noise of any kind. Just the wind working at the tin roof in the particular register it had found decades ago and never changed, and the settling sounds of a structure that had been through enough seasons to know how to be cold without drama, and a darkness outside so complete it pressed against the window glass like a physical presence. She found the kerosene lamp on the shelf where it had always been, apparently. Its chimney was smoke-blackened, but when she lifted it, it was heavy with fuel. Someone had filled it recently enough that it hadn't evaporated. She lit it, trimmed the wick until the flame was steady and even, and set it on the table. She sat with the lamp for a while. Then, without any specific intention, she picked it up and set it in the window. It threw its yellow light outward into the dark. She watched it for a moment. The small flame doubled in the glass, and then she set about making herself a place to sleep. She did not know as she laid her sleeping bag on the loft mattress and listened to the wind find new complaints in the eaves that she had just repeated. something her grandfather had done every single night for 30 years. She did not know that the lamp in the window was a signal he had maintained through every season, summer and winter, clear nights and blizzard nights, nights when he was home, and nights when he drove down to town for supplies and left it burning anyway, because a lamp in the window isn't a message you send only when you're there to send it. She did not know that her grandfather had believed with the quiet conviction of a man who had seen enough of the world to know which bets were worth making, that the light was not for the nights when someone came. It was for all the nights they didn't, so it would already be burning on the one night they did. She just thought the cabin was dark. She thought the lamp looked right in the window. She was not wrong about that. She fell asleep to the sound of wind and the distant, irregular conversation of something moving in the spruce at the edge of the clearing, and she slept deeply the way you sleep at altitude, the mountain pressing down on you like a hand generous and impersonal. She was not sure what woke her. It was not a sound exactly. It was more the particular quality of a silence that had changed, a silence that contained something it hadn't contained before she slept. She lay still in the loft and listened. The stove had gone to banked coals. The lamp was still burning in the window below. She could see its light from where she lay, the way it defined the edge of the loft opening. The wind on the roof had dropped to nothing. Outside, the deep pre-dawn dark that comes before any gray enters the sky. Then a sound from directly above her, not above the loft. Above the loft, through the single layer of boards between the sleeping space and the space above it that the floor plan had not accounted for, because it wasn't listed, wasn't in the county. Records wasn't supposed to be there. A person adjusting their position on a mattress. Wren sat up. She came down the loft ladder without hurrying, because hurrying in the dark on an unfamiliar ladder with bare feet was how you broke something, and she took the iron poker from beside the stove, the way you take an umbrella when you're not sure about the weather, as a precaution, not a plan. She stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked up. The loft extended toward the front of the cabin, toward the window with the lamp. What she had not noticed, what you would not notice unless you looked for it specifically, was that the loft itself had a ladder at its far end that continued upward into a space above the main loft that was accessed through a trap door in the ceiling. A storage space. Except that the trap door was not flush. It was open a crack. And through that crack came the very faint sound of slow, even breathing. Wren climbed the loft, crossed it in her socks, and stood at the base of the upper ladder. She looked up at the trap door. "I know you're up there," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "You can come down on your own, or I can come up. Either way, we're going to talk." A long pause. Then the trap door opened fully, and a figure came down the upper ladder with the deliberateness of someone who has decided that running is not an option worth taking. He was 17 years old. She could see that immediately in the way a person's age is visible in the specific combination of height and proportion, tall but not finished with it, the height of someone still growing into a frame that would eventually suit him, but currently gave the impression of a structure not yet braced against the load it was meant to carry. He had a knit cap pulled low, and a canvas jacket too large across the shoulders, and the kind of stillness that is not calm so much as practiced the stillness of a person who has learned that sudden movement in the presence of adults is usually inadvisable. He did not run. He did not lunge. He did not argue. He simply descended the ladder, and when he reached the loft floor, he looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of someone taking an accurate measure of a situation that has changed unexpectedly. His eyes went to the poker in her hand. They registered it without fear. She had the impression that unexpected things in the hands of adults were not new information to this person. Then they moved to her face. "I didn't know anybody was coming," he said. Not an apology. A statement of fact establishing what he had and had not known. "Who are you?" Wren said. "Sable." He said it the way you say a name in a place where your name is one of the few things that is actually yours. "Marsh? I've been up here since March." "Since March," Wren repeated. It was November. 8 months. "You've been living in the ceiling of my grandfather's cabin for 8 months. "He knew," Sable said, and something shifted in his voice when he said it. Not defensiveness, but care. The care of someone protecting the reputation of a person who cannot speak for themselves. "He put the mattress up there himself. He brought food. He said—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that he pulled back before it could be identified. "He said the loft was mine as long as I wanted it." "He said that," Wren said. "Yes." "When did you last see him?" Sable looked at her steadily, and she understood before he answered that this was about to be the kind of information that lands on a person rather than simply arriving. "September," he said. "He drove down to Elkins for supplies. He said he'd be back in 2 days. A pause so precise it felt measured. He wasn't. He hadn't known. 8 months in the ceiling of a dead man's cabin, keeping the firewood stacked and the path to the spring clear, and the place from falling apart further, because Asa Calloway had told him the loft was his, and it had not occurred to Sable Marsh to question the terms of the arrangement just because the man who had made it was no longer there to enforce them. Wren stood in the lamplight with the poker hanging forgotten at her side, and looked at this boy who had done exactly what he'd been told to do by the only adult who had ever told him something worth doing. "He passed away," she said. "In October. I'm his granddaughter." Sable received this information the way he seemed to receive everything, without visible reaction, processing it inward rather than outward. His jaw set. His eyes dropped to the loft floor for a moment and then came back up. He nodded once, a small contained movement that contained more than it showed. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't." They stood there for a moment in the lamplight. "I'll get my things," he said. "You don't have to do that tonight," Wren said, before she'd decided to say it. He looked at her. "It's 4 in the morning," she said. "It's 30 degrees outside. Get your things in the morning." Something moved through his face that was not quite relief and not quite surprise, but was in the neighborhood of both the expression of a person who has been handed something they had stopped expecting to be handed and doesn't yet know how to hold it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Wren said. She climbed back down to the main loft and lay down on her sleeping bag and listened to the sound of him settling back into his space in the ceiling and she looked at the lamp burning in the window below, throwing its light into the dark, and she thought about 3 mugs on a kitchen shelf for a man who lived alone, and she thought about a mattress in a storage space above a loft in a cabin on a mountain, and she thought about a boy in a canvas jacket, too large for him, who had kept a dead man's firewood stacked for 2 months because the dead man had said the loft was his. She did not go back to sleep for a long time. In the morning, Sable did not get his things. He was splitting wood in the clearing when she came down from the loft, working with the economical precision of someone who has done this enough that it has stopped being a skill and become a reflex. He had set up a round, positioned the maul, and was working through the pile that had been stacked against the south wall of the cabin without looking at it, his eyes moving between his work and the tree line, the way a person moves their eyes when they are accustomed to monitoring their surroundings. Wren made coffee and carried 2 cups out to the porch steps. She set one on the step below her without offering it. He put down the maul and came to the porch and took the cup and sat on the bottom step without being asked, and they looked at the clearing and the iron giant above it and the spruce beyond, and the morning came into the saddle with the gradual absolute certainty of mountain mornings. "Foster care," Sable said eventually, apropos of nothing except the conversation they had not yet had. He said it the way a person reads a fact off a document they have read many times, flat, all the feeling carefully relocated elsewhere. 11 houses. They give you a trash bag of your stuff and a list of numbers that mostly don't pick up. Then you're 18 and you're supposed to know how to be a person. Wren held her cup in both hands and looked at the tower. "I was walking the county road," he said. "It was raining, cold rain. I saw the light up the mountain and I walked toward it." She turned to look at him. "I figured it was a trap, to be honest," he said, and there was something that might have been the edge of dry humor in it. "Nobody leaves a light on for nothing. Took me 3 nights of watching from the tree line before I knocked." "What changed your mind?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at his cup. "Got cold enough," he said. "And he never once made me say thank you. Most people, you take their help, they need you to keep paying it back and being grateful." He turned the cup in his hands. "Asa just acted like I'd done him the favor, like I was the one who'd shown up with something he needed." Wren looked at the cabin behind her at the window where the lamp had burned all night, and she turned back to the tower. 140 feet of weathered steel standing in the morning light, with the patience of something that had been here longer than everyone currently alive, and intended to remain so. She had not called the realtor. She had meant to call the realtor. She looked at the tower, and the tower looked back, or seemed to, from its height with its glass cab catching the early light. "How do you get up?" she said. Sable looked at the tower, then at her. "There's a key for the gate padlock," he said. "Asa kept it on a nail inside the doorframe, left side, about shoulder height." She looked at him. "He said the best of the whole day is at the top," Sable said. "He said most people never climb a thing they own." Wren set her cup on the porch rail. She went inside and ran her hand along the left door frame until she found the nail and the key hanging from it, small and flat. The kind of key that opens a simple padlock, unremarkable, except for the fact of its existence and its location, which was exactly where someone would put a key. They wanted a specific person to find without making a production of it. She came back out. "You should be careful on the stairs," Sable said. "Third landing, 2 of the bolts on the outside rail have worked loose. Don't lean on that section." "Have you been up?" "Most mornings," he said. "Asa went up every clear afternoon. Said he needed to read the weather before it arrived." Wren looked at the tower. She looked at the key in her hand. She was supposed to call the realtor. She was supposed to take photographs and make arrangements and be back in Pittsburgh by Friday. She had 22 words on a sticky note, and a mother who was waiting for this mountain to be dealt with, and a life in the spare room that was the shape of something that had not yet started. She crossed the clearing to the tower gate. The padlock opened on the first try. She began to climb. The first flight of stairs was steeper than she expected, and the steel rang under her boots with a sound that carried out across the clearing and into the spruce, and came back as a faint echo from the hillside. The railing was cold through her gloves. The structure moved very slightly, in the way that tall metal structures move in wind, not alarmingly but perceptibly, a living quality to the steel that she had not anticipated. It was not frightening. It was honest. It told the truth about what it was, not solid ground, but a framework above ground, a human construct attached to the earth, but extending above it, subject to the same forces as everything that grows tall. She climbed past the first landing. The clearing dropped away. She could see the cabin's tin roof going gray-green in the morning sun, and the truck parked at the edge of the clearing, and Sable below her small, now watching her go up with the cup of coffee in both hands. She climbed past the second landing. The spruce canopy was level with her now, and then below her the dark green of the treetops giving way to the gray rock of the summit ridges on either side of the saddle, and beyond those ridges the folded blue distances of the Allegheny Plateau, extending into a horizon that was very far away. She found the third landing and avoided the outer rail on the right side, where she could see the loose bolts Sable had described. She could see the gap in the threading, the way the metal had worked over time, and she filed it away as something that needed fixing before anything else used that section. She climbed. At 140 feet, the wind was different. Not louder exactly, but more present, more there. It came from a direction, had a force pushed against her with the cheerful indifference of something that was going where it was going regardless. The glass cab of the observation room was just above her, a square room perhaps 8 feet on a side entirely enclosed in glass panels that were original military issue, thick and slightly wavy, in the way of old glass, distorting the view just enough to remind you that you were looking through something made by human hands. She worked the latch on the cab door and pushed it inward and stepped inside. The smell was old wood and machine oil and cold glass and something beneath those things that she could not name and did not try to. The room was small and purposeful in the way of spaces designed for a specific kind of work. A stool was bolted to the floor in the center, positioned for the widest possible view in every direction. A map table under a sheet of scratched glass, its topographic surface worn soft from decades of hands tracing routes across it. A fire-finding instrument. The Osborne Fire Finder, she knew the name from her environmental science courses, mounted on its pivot in the center of the table, its sighting ring tarnished to a deep copper color. On the wall to her left, mounted in a bracket that had clearly been purpose-built for it, a pair of binoculars. Not fire lookout binoculars, military binoculars from the look of them. The Barr and Stroud model from the 1940s, the kind the British Army had used and surplus quantities of, had made their way into American hands after the war. Still in their original leather case, still she unclipped them and raised them to her eyes, still perfectly functional, the lenses clear, the optics sharp enough to pull the far ridgeline into crisp relief. She lowered them. On the map table beside the firefinder was a logbook. Old, its cover worn smooth pages, thickened by years of mountain humidity. She opened it to a random page and read her grandfather's handwriting, small and square, and slanting very slightly. Uphill, recording the weather, the visibility, the fire risk conditions for a date in August. 3 years ago. The precision of it, the dailiness, the record of 40 years of morning weather readings from the highest point in Pendry County. She turned to the front of the logbook. The first entry was dated the summer of 1983, which was before her mother was old enough to drive. She turned to the back. The last entry was dated September of this year, 10 days before her grandfather had driven down to Elkins for supplies and not come back. The handwriting was the same as the first entry. 40 years, and the handwriting had not changed. She stood with the logbook in her hands and looked out the south-facing windows at the view her grandfather had read every clear afternoon for 40 years. And then she saw it. She had not been looking for it. Her eyes had been moving across the walls of the cab in the automatic way you take in a new room, noting the details. The binoculars, the logbook, the firefinder, the map table, the small propane heater in the corner that someone had installed at some point after the military decommissioned the tower. And then her eyes reached the wall to the right of the door, where the inside surface of the glass panel met the wooden frame. Tacked to the wooden frame slightly above eye level was a piece of paper. It had been there a long time. The tape holding it had yellowed to amber, and the paper itself had gone the particular color that paper goes in a place with high humidity and decades of slow oxidation, not fully yellow but not quite white either. Something in between. Something that belonged to both the past and the present simultaneously. She stepped closer. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon with the particular combination of ambition and technical limitation that belongs to a 7-year-old working seriously at something they care about. A mountain rendered as a triangle with a smaller triangle on top. A sun in the upper right corner, its rays the careful straight lines of a child who has been told that rays go outward and has taken this instruction seriously. And in the foreground, 2 figures, stick figures, but detailed stick figures. Each one had a distinguishable face, 2 dots for eyes and a curved line for a mouth. And they were holding hands, their arms extended between them, signed in the careful block capitals of a child who has only recently learned to do this, WWII. Age 7. She had been 7 years old in 2009. She had been on this mountain for 6 weeks. In the summer of 2009, the one summer her mother had sent her, she did not remember drawing this. She did not remember climbing this tower as a 7-year-old, though she must have with her grandfather's hand on her shoulder and his voice telling her something she had not retained in language, but perhaps had retained in some other form. What she retained was this: the sense of his hand on her shoulder, the smell of him, the feeling of being very high up and very safe simultaneously, which was a combination she had not felt since, and which she had not until this moment understood that she was missing. He had kept it on the wall of his lookout for 15 years, not in a drawer, not in a folder, on the wall, in the place where he spent every clear afternoon of his working life, looking out over 100 square miles of forest and reading the weather and watching for smoke. Her drawing had been part of that view, part of what he looked at, part of what the room contained for him for 15 years. Wren stood in the glass cab at the top of the Iron Giant with her grandfather's binoculars in one hand and her 7-year-old self's drawing in front of her face, and the mountains spread out in every direction below, and she understood something that she did not have words for yet. She would find the words later, but the understanding arrived now in the way that the most important understandings sometimes arrive completely quietly, without announcement. The way the light changes on a mountain when the clouds shift. She was not here to close a door. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she turned and looked out the south-facing windows, at the view her grandfather had looked at every day for 40 years, the folded ridges and dark forest, and the far-off smear of a town 20 miles away, and above all of it, the sky, which was doing what the mountain sky does in November, cycling through its repertoire in the span of an hour, the clouds moving through in their lateral, unhurried procession. She looked out the windows of the cab at the 100 square miles of forest her grandfather had watched over for 4 decades. She looked down at the clearing below. The cabin's single window threw a yellow rectangle of light into the morning. She had left the lamp burning. She had trimmed the wick and left it in the window where she'd put it the night before. And from up here, 140 feet in the air, it was the only warm light visible in any direction, a single point of yellow in the gray morning, small and steady and burning, for no particular reason, except that she had put it there. She understood in that moment something about the lamp that she had not understood the night before when she lit it. She went back down the tower, carefully minding the 3rd landing, her boots ringing on the steel with each step. Sable was still in the clearing when she reached the bottom, sitting on the porch steps, with a 2nd cup of coffee, watching her descend. She crossed the clearing and stood in front of him. "There's a drawing on the wall up there," she said. "One I made when I was 7 years old." Sable looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "He told me not to touch it." Wren looked at the tower, then at the cabin, then at the boy on the porch steps who had kept a dead man's firewood stacked and his path to the spring clear for 2 months because the dead man had said the loft was his. She did not call the realtor that day. She had not decided not to call. She simply found as the morning moved through the cabin and the light changed, and Sable showed her how the spring path worked and what the stove required, that she never picked up her phone. And by the time the afternoon came and the Iron Giant threw its long shadow across the clearing, it was too late in the day to make a business call, and she told herself she would do it in the morning. In the morning, she replaced the rotted section of porch railing with a length of spruce that Sable cut, and she notched, working together in a careful silence that was not uncomfortable. Her hands knew more than she had known they knew. Her father, who she saw 3 times a year and called on holidays, had taught her basic carpentry in the summers, and the knowledge had been sitting in her hands for years, waiting for something to do. The realtor's number stayed untouched in her phone. That evening, for the first time, Sable ate dinner inside. He came in from the cold without being invited, sat down at the table while Wren was putting food on it, and ate, without watching the door the entire time. It was a small thing. It felt significant in the way that small things sometimes do, when they are actually large things wearing modest clothing. After dinner in the lamplight, with the wind working at the tin roof and the darkness pressed against the windows, Wren looked at the 3 mugs on the kitchen shelf. She looked at the lamp in the window burning its patient yellow burn. She thought about a drawing on the wall of a glass cab 140 feet in the air, kept there for 15 years, looked at every clear afternoon by a man who had never once told his granddaughter he had it. She understood that she was in the early stages of learning something. She did not know yet what it was, but she was beginning to understand that the cabin had been trying to tell her something all along, from the 3 mugs to the mattress in the ceiling, to the key on the nail by the door, telling it in the only language available to it, which was the language of objects arranged with intention of small facts, pointing toward large ones of a door, that she was beginning to suspect had never actually been closed. She did not call the realtor on the 3rd day, either. She told herself it was because she was busy. This was true in the way that incomplete answers are true, accurate as far as they went, stopping before they arrived at the part that mattered. She was busy. She had found on the 2nd morning that the cabin's north wall had lost its chinking in 3 substantial sections, and that the West Virginia November was using these gaps with the efficiency of a draft that had been planning this for some time. She mixed the repair compound in a coffee can the way the YouTube video she found with 2 bars of cell service instructed, and she spent the better part of that day on her knees, against the cold logs, packing the mixture into the gaps with a putty knife and smoothing it with her thumb. Sable worked beside her. Not with her beside her at the particular angle of a person who has learned through long experience that proximity and collaboration are different things, that you can work alongside someone without being vulnerable to them, that the distance of 3 feet and a slight offset of the shoulder is sufficient to maintain the option of retreat. He was faster with the putty knife than she was. He did not say so. He simply worked at a pace that allowed her to match it if she chose. "How long did you know him?" Wren asked on the 2nd afternoon of the chinking work. "About a year," Sable said. He smoothed a section flat with his thumb, examined it, smoothed it again. "I came up the road in March. He didn't ask me anything. He just put food in front of me and showed me the loft. He didn't ask where you came from. He asked if I was cold." Sable scraped the excess compound off the putty knife against the rim of the can. "That was it. He asked if I was cold, and when I said yes, he put more wood on the stove." He paused. "Most adults, the first thing they want to know is the story. Like the story is a ticket you have to pay with before they decide if you deserve to be warm." Wren handed him the next portion of compound. He took it without looking up. He never asked for the ticket, Sable said, in a whole year. They worked in silence for a while after that, the wind coming off the ridge and the sound of the compound being pressed into old wood and the distant commentary of a crow somewhere in the spruce. "What did you talk about?" Wren said. "He talked," Sable said. "I listened mostly. That was okay with him, I think. He didn't need me to fill anything in." He packed a long section of the wall, carefully pressing with the heel of his hand. He talked about the tower, about the forest, about fire behavior, how it moves uphill faster than downhill, how a fire in dry August can outrun a man on flat ground, how you can tell from the color of the spruce in a dry year where a fire would run if one started. He glanced sideways. He said the tower wasn't about watching for fire. He said anybody could see a fire once it was burning. The tower was about seeing it when it was still small enough to stop. Wren looked at the iron giant visible above the cabin roof through the gap in the trees. "He was talking about more than fires," she said. "Yes," Sable said. "I figured that out eventually." She was not calling the realtor, because every time she picked up her phone with that intention, she noticed something that required her to put it down again. The careful way the shelves had been built, level, evenly spaced with a small lip along the front edge that kept things from sliding off in the way a person constructs a shelf when they intend it to hold things for other people, not just for themselves. The hooks on the porch beam at 3 different heights, which made no sense for a single man, unless you understood that the 3 different heights corresponded to 3 different sizes of backpack, which was a detail that would only occur to someone who had spent time observing the backpacks of people who arrived carrying everything they owned. The second mattress. It was rolled and tied with a length of cord in the corner of the upper loft space. The space above Sable's space, tucked against the far wall, with the neatness of something stored for use, rather than something stored and forgotten. A second mattress. Not the loft mattress that Sable used, and not the one in the main sleeping loft. A third one rolled and ready. 3 mugs, 2 mattresses in reserve, hooks at graduated heights. The cabin kept showing her the same thing in different forms, the way a patient teacher returns to the same concept through different examples, until the student finally arrives at the principle rather than the instance. On the 4th day, she made up her mind to climb the tower again. She had not been up since the first morning since the drawing, and the binoculars and the logbook and the weight of 15 years of her grandfather looking at a piece of paper she had no memory of making. She had been processing that. She was still processing it in the way you process, something that has shifted the fundamental geometry of your understanding and requires you to remap the territory before you can move through it again. Sable was in the clearing splitting wood when she came out of the cabin with the tower key. "Third landing," he said without looking up. "Right side of the outer rail, 2 bolts." "I know," she said. "I'm going to fix it." He stopped mid-swing and looked at her. "I need a socket wrench and the right bolt size," she said. "What did he keep tools in while lean-to?" Sable said. "Left of the door as you go in, metal box, green lid." She found the toolbox, found a socket set in better condition than she expected, found bolts of the right thread and diameter in the coffee can that held sorted hardware. She put everything in a canvas bag and went back to the tower. The climb took longer with the bag. She went carefully, feeling the sway of the structure in the wind, which was coming harder than it had the first morning. Out of the northwest, in the particular way of November wind that has decided to commit. By the time she reached the third landing, her hands were cold, and her shoulders ached with the pleasant, informative ache of muscles being used correctly. She found the loose bolts exactly where Sable had described. The metal had worked in its housing over years of thermal cycling, the steel expanding and contracting through enough seasons that the original installation had lost its friction fit. She pulled the socket wrench from the bag and got to work lying flat on the landing grating to get the angle she needed, and it took her 40 minutes and 2 skinned knuckles and a creative renegotiation of her body position, but both bolts went home solid, and when she stood and leaned her weight against the rail, it did not yield. She stood on the third landing and looked out over the forest. The wind pushed at her hair and her jacket, and the canvas bag hanging from the railing. And below her, Sable had gone back to the wood, and the cabin's tin roof was a rectangle of nickel gray in the clearing, and the lamp, she had left it in the window again burning, because she had left it burning each night, and had started leaving it during the day too. Without deciding to, was a small warm point visible through the window glass, even in the gray daylight. She climbed the rest of the way to the cab. She went to her drawing first. She stood in front of it the way you stand in front of something you need to look at until you understand it. 2 stick figures holding hands. The mountain. The sun with its careful, straight-line rays. She had been 7 years old. She had been up here with her grandfather, and she had sat in this cab with him and looked out at his 100 square miles of forest, and at some point she had produced a crayon from somewhere and drawn this, and he had taped it to the wall, and it had been here ever since. She remembered suddenly and completely the crayon. It had been in her jacket pocket. She had been carrying it for weeks because she had been going through a period of drawing everything she saw, which was a thing she had done intensely for about 3 months at age 7, and then stopped in the way children sometimes abandon entire modes of being as abruptly as they took them up. She had drawn this in the tower, and he had asked her if she wanted to leave it, and she had said yes, and he had produced tape from somewhere, the man who kept everything, and put it on the wall. She had forgotten. Children forget. But he had kept it in the one place where he was certain to see it every day. She turned from the drawing and went to the map table. She opened the logbook and turned to the last few entries. September weather readings, fire risk assessments, notes on wind direction and barometric pressure, and the condition of the forest in the dry end of summer. His handwriting small and square and tilted very slightly uphill, as reliable in its appearance as the tower itself. She closed the logbook. She looked around the cab one more time. The firefinder, the binoculars, the military maps still in their cases in the wall bracket, the propane heater in the corner, the stool bolted to the floor. Everything purposeful. Everything in the right place. The room of a man who understood that the work required the tools, and the tools required maintenance, and maintenance required the discipline to do the small things consistently, so that when the large thing happened, when the smoke appeared on the horizon, you were ready. She climbed back down. On the 7th day, she found the floor. She had been moving the wood stove, or attempting to, because the stovepipe connection to the wall flue needed resealing. And to reseal it properly, she needed to shift the stove 2 inches to the right and 2 inches away from the wall, which required levering it off its hearthstones with a length of pipe she'd found in the lean-to. She had the pipe positioned and was applying controlled pressure when the stove lifted off its stones, and she swept the exposed hearth to reset the bricks, and the broom caught. Not on a nail or a rough stone edge. It caught on a seam. She stopped. She crouched down and looked at the seam and then ran her finger along it. Straight, clean. Running along the edge of a single floor plank in a line too precise to be a gap that had opened, with age, a gap that had been put there. She measured the plank with her eye. It was the right width to lift. It was not nailed, she could see that. The others were nailed the heads, just visible, but this one had no nails. On its visible surface, she got the blade of her pocket knife into the seam and pried. The board came up with a dry, woody scrape, and beneath it was a cavity in the floor. Joists, dry and clean and cold, sealed from the mountain air, and the mountain's moisture by the board above it, and sealed from below by a sheet of the same roofing tin that covered the cabin's exterior tucked flat against the underside of the joists. Cold air came up from the cavity carrying the smell of old paper and metal, and something else, the particular smell of things that have been very still for a very long time. Inside 3 leather-bound ledgers stacked flat, a green metal cash box with a simple lock, and a coffee tin, the 3-pound kind, its lid sealed around the rim with a strip of electrical tape, far heavier when she lifted it than any 3-pound coffee tin had any business being. Wren sat back on her heels and looked at what she had found. She lifted the top ledger out with both hands. The leather was dark and soft-cornered, worn at the edges, in the way of things handled regularly over a long span of years. When she turned back the cover, the inside of the front was blank, but the first page was her grandfather's handwriting, small and square and slanting uphill, dated October 9th, 1979. She took the ledger to the table by the window, and she sat down and she read. The first entry was about a man named Rucker, who had walked off a mining shift and kept walking, and ended up on Saddle Knob without planning to. The entry was half a page long. It recorded what Rucker had said, and what Asa had said, and what they had eaten, and what time Rucker had left in the morning, and at the end it said, "Told him the lamp stays lit if he ever needs it. He won't come back, but the door's not locked." She turned the page. The next entry was 3 weeks later. A woman named Briar Doss and her 2 children one night, and gas money for a sister's place in Ohio in the morning. Lamp stays lit. Doors not locked. Told her she could come back. She turned pages. Names, dates, reasons. The reasons were always given when they were known, and left blank when they weren't, and the blank entries were not explained or apologized, for simply recorded as a person and a date and a duration and a note about what had been provided, and then the same line at the end, "Lamp stays lit. Doors not locked." She read for a long time. She read past the light shifting in the window, and past the sound of sable coming in from the cold, and going up to the loft, and she read by lamplight when the daylight was no longer sufficient, and she read with the particular completeness of someone who has been handed a document that reorganizes everything they thought they understood about the subject. A boy of 17, 3 nights in 1981, name given as initials only. A family whose truck had broken down on the county road in a January ice storm 1984. A woman who had driven up the mountain in 1994, meaning not to drive back down, and who had been sat with and talked to and fed and kept through 2 nights, and sent home on the 3rd day with a full tank of gas and a phone number for a counselor in Elkins who owed Asa a favor. Page after page, name after name. The same line at the end of almost every one. The lamp stays lit. The door's not locked. She was near the end of the 3rd ledger when she found her mother. The entry was dated 18 years ago, which would have made Margaret Calloway 26, which was before Wren was born, which was before her mother had met her father, which was before any of the life Wren knew about her mother had happened. The entry was longer than most half a page, which in Asa's compressed handwriting was considerable. Maggie called tonight, it began. She's down in the city now, working a job she doesn't talk about for people she doesn't name. She sounded the way she always sounds when things aren't right, which is fine. She's used the word fine more in this conversation than a person should ever need to in one call. She won't come up. She says the mountain is in the past and she doesn't go backward. I didn't argue. You can't argue with a person about which direction they've decided to go. She's got her mother's jaw, sets it, and that's the end of negotiation. She's also got her mother's way of going so quiet when something hurts that you have to read the silence rather than the words. I read it tonight. I heard what she didn't say. The lamp's lit for her. The door's not locked for her. I keep it lit for my own child most of all. She'll come back when she's ready. Or she won't. But the door won't be locked on my end. That part I can control. Wren sat at the table with her hand flat on the page and read her grandfather's entry about her mother twice and then a 3rd time, and then she sat back and looked at the lamp in the window. Her mother had called 18 years ago, when Wren did not yet exist, when her mother was a young woman in a city with a job she didn't talk about and a jaw set against going backward. Her grandfather had read the silence in the call and written it down and added her to the list and kept the lamp lit for her the same as everyone else, the same as the man who had walked off his mining shift and the woman who had driven up, meaning not to drive back down. The same as Sable, who had seen a light from the last switchback and walked toward it. The same as Wren herself, who had set the lamp in the window on the 1st night because the cabin was dark and it seemed like the right place for it. She was sitting with the ledger in her hands when she heard the engine. She knew before she looked what kind of engine it was, the particular note of it deep and smooth and expensive in the specific way of vehicles that have been selected to communicate something about the person inside them. She crossed to the window and looked out. A silver pickup, clean as anything she had seen in 6 days on this mountain, pulled into the clearing and stopped with the precision of a vehicle being positioned rather than parked. The door opened and a man got out, who did not belong on Saddle Knob in any of the ways that were visible. In the first 10 seconds, the quilted vest that had never met a thorn, the boots with the clean synthetic soles, the unhurried movement of someone who has already decided how an encounter is going to resolve. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the tower. He looked at Wren's truck with the Pittsburgh plates. Then he came to the porch. "Miss Calloway," he said, which told her he already knew more than she had disclosed. "Royce Dannert, Highland Reserve Development." He had a card in his hand before she opened the door held out to her at the exact angle that made it awkward not to take. She took it. She did not invite him in. "I made your grandfather a fair offer on this parcel 4 times over the last 9 years, Dannert said. He said it conversationally without heat, the way a man recites a history he has organized to his advantage. He declined each time, never gave me a reason I could do anything with. I respected his stubbornness, honestly. But I'd hate to see his decision cost you something it doesn't have to." Wren said nothing. "Let me be straightforward," he said. "I have 80 acres under contract surrounding this knob, all but this parcel." He turned and looked at the saddle, the view falling away east and south, 3 counties of folded blue Allegheny Plateau, visible from where they stood, the kind of view that makes architects do things with glass. "This is the only buildable summit in 40 miles with access and that sight line. Without the saddle, the project doesn't work. With it, I've got 31 rooms, a restaurant, a full lodge operation. This 11 acres is the piece the whole thing is built around." He named a number, $40,000. He watched her face the way someone watches a face when they're looking for specific information. She kept her expression where she had put it. "I'd need to think about it," she said, which was true and which gave nothing away. "Of course," he said. He smiled the way men smile when they believe the outcome is already established, and the conversation is simply the formality preceding it. People in your situation usually find the math clarifies things once they sit with it. People in your situation. She heard the phrase the way you hear a phrase that has been used on you before in a different voice with different specific content, but the same underlying architecture. The gentle, informative condescension of someone who has assessed your circumstances and decided they are leverage. Glenn had said it to her mother. She had heard her mother repeat it in the flat voice of someone quoting something they haven't finished processing. Dannert left his card on the porch rail and went back to the silver truck and backed carefully out of the clearing, the tires finding every rock with the delicacy of tires that have never had to navigate anything that required genuine caution. Wren stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded into the spruce. Sable appeared from the corner of the cabin. He had been there, she understood, since before the truck arrived. He stood with his arms folded and watched the tree line where the road disappeared. "That's the lodge man," he said. "Asa ran him off twice. The surveyor, too, before him." "The surveyor?" Wren said. "Came up twice over the summer with equipment. Set up on the south ridge." He looked at her. "Asa walked out with the shotgun the second time. Not raised, just carrying it." A pause. The surveyor left. Wren looked at the card in her hand, then at the tree line, then at the tower rising above the spruce with its particular combination of permanence and age. That night she sat at the table alone after Sable had gone up to the loft. The ledgers were open in front of her. The cash box was beside them, and beside the cash box, the coffee tin. She had opened the cash box. Inside $217 in small bills, soft from handling. A folded receipt from a hardware store, dated 1981, for 2 cots and a kerosene heater, and a key. Brass, simple, the kind that opened a small lock rather than a door, a box lock, the kind used for storage cases and filing cabinet drawers. She had looked at the key for a long time and put it on the table beside the cash box, and not yet determined what it opened. She peeled the electrical tape off the rim of the coffee tin and opened the lid. Letters. She knew immediately that they were letters by the shape of folded paper and the visible edges of envelopes, but the quantity of them took a moment to absorb. She counted them twice, the way you count something when the first count doesn't feel right. Both counts gave her the same number, 61. 61 letters in 61 different handwritings on paper, ranging from lined notebook sheets to church bulletins to what appeared to be the inside of a cereal box, all of them addressed in one way or another to her grandfather on this mountain. She read several of them at the table by lamplight, and then she had to stop, not because she was finished, but because the cumulative weight of them was more than she could hold all at once. A woman named Briar Doss, the woman with the children from the second ledger entry, the gas money for Ohio, had written to say that she and the children were fine, and the sister's couch had turned into an apartment, and the apartment had turned into a job, and the job had turned into a life. And she had meant to write sooner, and was sorry she hadn't, and she wanted him to know that there was a night on Saddle Knob that she thought about every single day. A man who signed his name only as R.P. wrote 4 lines, saying that $40 and a tank of gas had gotten his family through the month. The plant closed in 1986, and that he had paid it forward 11 times since, and that he kept count. A letter in the careful, oversized handwriting of someone young, perhaps 15 or 16, that said only, "Thank you for not asking me anything," signed with 2 initials, the same 2 initials as an entry in the third ledger. A boy 3 nights. Initials only 1981. 43 years of letters from 61 people, all of them finding their way to the same address on a mountain road in Pendry County. Wren set the last letter she had read back in the tin and sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the lamp in the window. She was 22 years old. She had dropped out of school and she had no job, and she had $40,000 sitting on the table in the form of a developer's offer, and enough debt that $40,000 would do real, specific, quantifiable things for her life. She had done the math. She was her grandfather's granddaughter and her mother's daughter. And she had done the math 4 different ways, and all 4 ways gave her the same answer. She opened the third ledger to the page she had found earlier, her mother's page. She read it again. The lamp's lit for her. The door's not locked for her. I keep it lit for my own child most of all. She turned 2 more pages. There was a page dated 8 months ago, the month Sable had arrived. She had not read this far before. The entry was brief. A boy came up the road in March, saw the lamp from the switchback, stood at the tree line for 3 days before he knocked. Told him the loft was his. He doesn't say much. That's fine. Neither did I at 17. The lamp stays lit. Door's not locked. She turned 1 more page. The entry was dated 6 weeks before her grandfather had driven down to Elkins for supplies. 6 weeks before October. The handwriting was the same small square tilting uphill, but she could see in it what you sometimes see in handwriting toward the end of something, a slight change in the pressure of the pen, a slight slowing of the formation of letters, as though the hand was being more deliberate than usual. Wren called last week, it began. She had not remembered calling. She called her mother, and her mother sometimes mentioned him, and she thought she was almost certain that she had called once to ask her mother to pass along her birthday wishes, and perhaps her mother had given her the number, but she had no memory of the call itself. She had been in the middle of the semester. She had been managing 3 deadlines and a part-time job at the library and the beginning of the slow-motion collapse of her scholarship situation. She had called him apparently, and she had no specific memory of it, and he had written about it in his ledger. She sounded like she was holding herself together with the kind of effort that becomes invisible once you've done it for long enough. She's got my jaw. I think, though, she doesn't know it yet. And she's got her mother's way of going quiet around the things that hurt. She's 22. I was 40 before I understood what this knob was for. Maybe she'll be faster than me. She's smarter than I was. I wish she'd come up. I left the lamp lit. I always left it lit for her. She's my own. Wren sat at the table with her grandfather's words in front of her, and the lamp in the window throwing its light into the dark, and the 61 letters in the tin, and the key that opened something she hadn't found yet, and she understood with the total clarity that sometimes arrives after you have been circling something long enough. The clarity that is not the beginning of understanding, but the moment it completes, that she was not going to call Royce Dannert back. She was not going to call him because $40,000, which was a real number, attached to real consequences, was not the thing her grandfather had spent 40 years building on this mountain and selling it to a man in a clean vest who had looked at the view and seen 31 lodge rooms, was not the thing. The 61 letters in the coffee tin, and the lamp in the window, and the drawing on the wall of the glass cab were asking of her. She did not know yet how she was going to manage this practically. She did not know how she was going to explain it to her mother. She did not know what came next in any of the specific logistical ways that next things needed to be known. But she knew she was not going to call Royce Dannert back, and knowing that one thing gave her for the first time in 4 months the specific sensation of standing on ground that was actually under her feet rather than the slightly tilted, slightly uncertain surface she had been navigating since April. She picked up the brass key from the table. Small, simple. A box lock key. She held it in her hand and looked at it, and she knew it opened something that mattered, and she did not know yet what, and she put it in her jacket pocket where she would be able to find it. She blew out the lamp. Then she lit it again because the cabin had to be dark before she understood that the window was exactly where the lamp belonged, and you didn't take a light out of the window. It had been in for 30 years, just because the night happened to be quiet. She left it burning and climbed to the loft and lay down. Outside, the mountain was doing what it did, the wind in the spruce, the deep cold, the total generous dark of a place where no one had ever built anything bright enough to compete with the stars. And in the window below her, the lamp she had lit and relit, without fully understanding why, was burning its patient, small, yellow burn into the dark, visible from the last switchback on the forest road, visible from a long way off to anyone who was coming up through the night toward a light they had not been promised, but hoped to find. She slept. In the upper loft above, her Sable Marsh slept on the mattress that had been put there for him, in the cabin on the mountain that had been left with its door unlocked under the long, uninterrupted dark of the West Virginia sky. And outside, 140 feet above the clearing, the glass cab of the Iron Giant caught the starlight in the particular way of old military glass, distorting it slightly, making it strange, and threw it back at the sky the way things do when they have been standing in the same place for long enough that the standing itself becomes a kind of answer to the question of what they are for. The morning after Royce Dannert came and went, Wren woke before light and lay still in the loft and listened to the mountain. She had been doing this every morning since the first one, lying in the dark with her eyes open, listening to the particular vocabulary of Saddle Knob before the day got its full voice. The wind had its own grammar up here. It spoke differently through the spruce than through the hardwoods lower down, and differently again against the cabin's tin roof than against the tower's steel framework. And she was beginning to know the difference, the way you begin to know a language when you stop translating it and start hearing it directly. The tower spoke at night in a low, almost subsonic frequency that she felt in her sternum more than heard with her ears. It had been doing this every night, and she had stopped noticing when it began, which meant she had stopped being a visitor. She climbed down from the loft in the cold gray of pre-dawn and built the fire from the banked coals, kneeling on the hearthstones and blowing steadily until the birch bark caught and the kindling went, and the iron began the slow tick of something warming from the inside out. She made coffee. She carried a cup to the table. She opened the third ledger to her own page and read it again in the early light. She had been doing this, too, returning to the page, the way you return to a thing you are still in the process of understanding, reading it again, not for new information, but for the continued company of it. He had heard something in her voice in a phone call she barely remembered making. He had written it down. He had kept the lamp lit for her specifically by name in the same sentence, where he kept it lit for everyone else, and the word own at the end of the entry was a word she was still learning to hold. She heard Sable moving above her, the particular creak of the upper loft that she had catalogued. By now, the one near the head of the mattress, followed by the one near the ladder, which meant he was awake and had been awake for some time and was deciding whether to come down. He came down. He poured his own coffee and sat across from her at the table and looked at the ledger. "How many of them are there?" he said. "Entries close to 200 across 3 books." She set her cup down. 61 letters in the tin. Sable looked at the coffee tin on the shelf where she had put it after reading through the night. "He wrote me down," he said, not a question. He wrote everyone down. He was quiet for a moment. "Can I see it?" She turned the ledger to the page. He looked at it for a long time without touching it the way you look at something you've been wanting to verify actually exists. Then he looked up. "I came up here in March and read it," he said. When he was still going down for supplies sometimes. He left the ledgers on the shelf. I thought they were record books, like weather records. I read a few pages before I understood what they were. His jaw worked slightly. "I found my page. I've come back to it, more than once." "I know," Wren said. "He wrote that too. He wrote that you were the kind of person who needed to be able to find the evidence of yourself." Sable looked at the table. Something moved through his face that he did not try to manage this time. A brief passage of something unguarded, and Wren looked at her coffee cup and gave him the privacy of not witnessing it directly. After a moment, he said, "What are you going to do about the developer?" "I don't know yet," Wren said. "But I'm not selling to him." Sable nodded once. He got up and put on his coat and went out to split wood, which was what he did in the mornings when he needed to be in motion. Wren sat with the ledger and the brass key she had put on the table beside her cup, and she thought about what she didn't know and what she needed to find out, and how little of either category she currently had a handle on. The answer to what she needed to find out came up the mountain 2 days later, and it came in the form of a faded blue sedan, with a knock in the engine, and a woman behind the wheel who drove with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been making difficult drives for a long time. Wren was at the table working through the second ledger when she heard the engine on the road. The sound was different from Dannert's truck, older, less performance, more intention. An engine that was not trying to make an impression, and therefore made one of a different kind. The sedan parked at a respectful distance from the cabin, and the woman who got out was in her late 60s, tall and straight-backed in a wool coat with a leather briefcase in one hand and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She stood by the car for a moment and looked at the cabin and the tower, the way you look at a place you have heard about for a long time, but are seeing for the first time. Then she came to the porch steps and stopped. "You'd be Wren," she said. "I would," Wren said. "Bet va. I practiced law down at the county seat for 30 years before I had the good sense to retire." She looked at the chimney smoke. "I came because Deputy Crail told me Asa Calloway's granddaughter was on the knob, and because a man in a silver truck has been asking questions at the courthouse about your access easement, and those two facts together got me out of a warm chair I'd been planning to die in." She looked at Wren over the rim of her glasses. "May I sit down?" Wren made coffee. They sat at the plank table, and Bet Va ran her hand along the wood with the particular attention of someone reacquainting themselves with a texture they remember. She had sat here once before, she said, 26 years ago. She took off her glasses, folded them, held them in both hands. "My son," she said, "my only one. He was 19 and he was in a bad way that I'm not going to put exact words to, because the words aren't mine to use, they're his, and he's used them in his own time and on his own terms." She turned the glasses over in her hands. "He drove up here in the dark because a man at the hospital, a janitor of all the people in that building, told him there was an old man on Saddle Knob who would sit with you without calling anyone you didn't want called." She looked at the lamp in the window. "Asa kept him for 3 days, fed him, walked the woods with him, did not lecture him, did not call me, did not call anyone. Just kept the light on and kept my boy breathing until my boy could do it himself." She put the glasses back on. "He's 45 now, 2 children, an engineer down in Roanoke." Her voice came back to level by a route that required effort. "So, when I tell you I am going to handle the man in the silver truck, I would like you to understand that I have been waiting 26 years for the chance to do something commensurate with what happened in this cabin. You would be doing me a kindness to let me." Wren looked at this woman who had waited 26 years and understood what patience looked like when it was not passivity but preparation. "He's claiming a problem with the access easement," Wren said. "He's not claiming it because it's a problem," Bet said. "He's claiming it because he's hoping you don't know enough to identify it as a bluff, which tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man he is and how he expects this to go." She set the briefcase on the table and opened it. "Walk me through what he said exactly." Wren walked her through it. The fire hazard claim, the easement question, the implication about his attorneys, and the 2 years they could spend making the property a problem she couldn't afford. Bet listened without interrupting, making 2 notes on a small pad, her pen moving in the efficient script of someone who has taken depositions for 30 years and learned to capture what matters without transcribing what doesn't. When Wren finished, Bet set down her pen. "The fire hazard," she said, "is a threat, not a fact. A man cannot condemn your home because he wants the view from it. The county has not cited you. He is betting the word inspection is frightening enough to move you. So we remove that word from his toolkit." She tapped the table. "We'll have a certified chimney sweep up here inside the week and an inspection on record inside 2. A 40-year-old stove maintained by a trained Forest Service professional is not a public nuisance, and any attorney who tells him otherwise is taking his money." She paused. "The access easement is older than Royce Dannert and recorded in plain language in the deed book. That is a bluff, and bluffs only work on people who can't call them." She looked at Wren directly. "So, we're going to make sure you can call it." Wren put the brass key on the table between them. Bet looked at it. She picked it up and held it near her reading glasses. "This was in the cash box," Wren said. "Under the floor. I've been through everything in the cabin and it doesn't fit anything here." Bet turned the key over once. Then she set it down with the deliberateness of someone identifying something they recognize. "That's a box lock key," she said. "The kind used for a small storage case or a filing lockbox." She looked at Wren. "Did your grandfather ever mention the Allegheny Highlands Land Trust to you?" "No," Wren said. "Did your mother ever mention any kind of conservation arrangement on this property?" "My mother doesn't talk about this property at all." Bet was quiet for a moment. She was clearly running a calculation of some kind, and running it carefully, and Wren waited while she ran it. "When I was still practicing," Bet said slowly, "I handled some conservation easement work for the Land Trust, the Allegheny Highlands. Land Trust. They have a small office in Elkins, about 2 desks and a coffee maker above a feed store." She looked at the key. "I know what their storage lock boxes look like. I helped set up the system." She tapped the table once, a decisive motion. "Get your coat. We're going to the courthouse first, then Elkins." They went to the courthouse in Bet's sedan. The knock in the engine was louder on the downhill grade, and Bet drove with the window cracked, regardless of the temperature, which Wren filed away as a character detail, consistent with everything else she had observed about this woman in 2 hours. The courthouse clerk was a woman named Erlene, who had worked in the deed office for 23 years, and who had known Asa Calloway the way the people in this county seemed to know him not through introduction or social proximity, but through the accumulated weight of small interactions over a long time. The kind of knowing that is constructed from seeing a person behave consistently in small moments until you understand who they are without having been told. Erline treated their request like a personal mission. It took an hour and a half working through the deed books with the focused competence of a woman who has spent 23 years learning a filing system she had inherited and then improved. She found it in Deed Book 214, page 88, recorded the 19th of June, 21 years ago. Bet put on her reading glasses and read it through. Then she read it again. Then she set her glasses on top of her head and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone confirming a suspicion they had held for a long time, but could not prove until this moment. Asa Webb Calloway, she read aloud, her voice steady and even, hereby grants in perpetuity the development rights to the real property, known as the Saddle Knob Parcel, Pendry County, West Virginia, comprising 11 acres, more or less, to the Allegheny Highlands, land trust to be held in conservation, easement in perpetuity, the terms of which restrict subdivision commercial development and the construction of any structure exceeding the footprint of the existing cabin and outbuildings. She set the document down on the counter. He did it 21 years ago, she said. In June. No announcement, no newspaper, no mention to anyone as far as I can tell. She looked at Wren. He gave away the development rights to this land, the thing Royce Dannert has been trying to buy for 9 years, 21 years ago, for nothing. He donated them. Wren stood at the deed book counter and absorbed this. The land can never be subdivided, Bet said. It can never host commercial lodging. It can hold the cabin and the outbuildings and nothing larger, and it will hold them for as long as there is a deed on this property, regardless of who owns it. Dannert's attorneys would have found this in a title search, Wren said. The arithmetic of it was arriving piece by piece, and each piece was clarifying something that had been obscure. A basic title search would turn this up in an afternoon. Yes, Bet said. It would. So he knew. He knew. Bet folded her glasses back onto their chain. Which tells you exactly what Royce Dannert was doing on your porch. He was not making you a legitimate offer on land he could build on. He was making a bet. She turned to face Wren fully, and there was something in her expression that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a person watching a long game reach its conclusion. He was betting that you didn't know what you had, that you were young and you were broke and you had just inherited a problem, and you would take $40,000 to make it go away. And then once it was his, he would go to the land trust, 2 desks above a feed store, always short on operating money, and he would make them an offer to amend the easement. Trade them a better parcel somewhere else, Wren said. Or write a check big enough to be tempting. It happens. Cash-poor conservation organizations have made worse decisions. Bet picked up the key from where Wren had set it on the counter. He was counting on 2 things, that the heir was ignorant and that the trust could be bought. She looked at the key. And he was wrong on both counts because your grandfather took the second variable off the table 21 years ago. And you took the first one off the table when you read 3 ledgers instead of calling the realtor. Erlene, who had been listening from the correct professional distance, excused herself to get her coat and offered to drive them to Elkins herself, which they declined and which she accepted by telling them exactly which turn to take after the feed store and writing Vesper Austin's direct number on a post-it note and pressing it into Wren's hand. They drove to Elkins in Bet's sedan with the knock in the engine and the window cracked against the November cold. The Allegheny Highlands Land Trust occupied the 2nd floor of a building above Henshaw's Feed and Seed on the main street, accessible by a wooden staircase on the side of the building and announced by a small sign so understated it appeared to be declining attention rather than seeking it. The office was 2 desks and a filing cabinet and a coffee maker that had seen significant use, and the woman who came out of the inner room when they knocked on the open door was in her early 60s, with the straight-backed posture of someone who has spent years carrying something difficult and learned to carry it without showing the weight. She looked at Wren, and her hand went to her mouth. "You're his," she said, not a question. The way the woman in the diner in Cairo had said it. The way that people in this county seemed to recognize Asa Calloway in the faces of the people he had loved without being told. "Vesper Austin," Bet said. "This is Wren Calloway, Asa's granddaughter." Vesper Austin sat down in the chair behind the nearest desk, not because she was weak, but because some moments require you to be seated before you can continue being upright. She looked at the key in Wren's hand. "I drove up Saddle Knob in 1994, she said. "I drove up meaning not to drive back down." She said it without drama, the way people say things that they have said before, to themselves and to others enough times that the saying has become a form of witnessing rather than confession. "The lamp in the window was the reason I have grandchildren." She looked at Wren. "He never told me he'd left a key for you." She stood and went to the filing cabinet at the back of the office and unlocked the bottom drawer with a key on her own key ring. From the back of the drawer, she withdrew a metal lockbox, small and green, the paint worn at the corners. She set it on the desk and stepped back. Wren put the brass key into the lock. It turned on the first try. Inside the box, the original signed conservation easement, the document recorded in Deed Book 214, page 88, with Asa Calloway's signature on the final page in his familiar small square hand, and beneath it a white envelope, thin, soft at the corners, from years in the box. Her name on the front in handwriting she now knew as well as her own. "For Wren, when she's ready." Bet Vaugh put her hand briefly on Wren's shoulder and then moved to the window and looked out at the Elkins street below, giving her the room. Vesper Austin said something about coffee and went to the outer office and did not come back for several minutes. Wren sat alone at the desk in the Allegheny Highlands Land Trust office above a feed store in Elkins, West Virginia, with her grandfather's last letter in her hands, and she opened it. She read it. She read it twice, and then she folded it carefully along its original creases, his creases, the fold lines he had made when he sealed it years ago. For a day he would not be present for, and she put it in the inside pocket of her jacket against her sternum, where she could feel it when she breathed. She did not tell Bet what it said. She did not tell Vesper. She did not tell Sable later or her mother later still. There are things that belong entirely to the person they were written for, and the letter was one of those things, and keeping it that way was the last instruction it gave, and Wren was going to follow it. What she told Bet on the drive back to Saddle Knob was that she was ready. The developer's call, when it came 2 days later, went to voicemail. Wren let it go to voicemail and listened to the message in the clearing at the base of the tower, with the cold coming off the ridge. Dannert's voice was smooth and patient, and informed by the confidence of a man who had been waiting out reluctant sellers for 30 years, and knew that reluctance was usually a negotiating posture rather than a position. He named a new number, $55,000. Wren deleted the message. She called Bet Vaugh and told her the new number, and Bet said what she expected Bet to say, which was that the new number confirmed everything they had already established about who Royce Dannert was and how he operated. Royce Dannert came up the mountain 8 days after his first visit. This time he got out of the truck to find Bet Vaugh already on the porch, standing in her wool coat, with the briefcase at her feet, and the particular posture of a woman who has been waiting precisely as long as the occasion required, and not 1 minute more. Wren stood at the top of the porch steps. Bet walked down to meet Dannert at the edge of the clearing, not confrontationally, not with theater, but with the efficient directness of someone who respects her own time, enough to not waste it on preamble. She had a manila envelope in her hand. She offered it to him at the point where he stopped walking. He took it. He opened it. He pulled the recorded easement halfway out and read the first paragraph, and his face did the thing that faces do when information arrives that reorganizes a situation the person thought they had under control. He pushed the document back into the envelope. He said something. His voice was flat and had lost the easy, conversational quality of his first visit. Bet answered. Wren was not close enough to hear the words, but she could read the shape of the exchange, the question and the answer and the follow-up, and the place where the follow-up ran out of ground and stopped. Dannert looked past Bet at Wren on the porch steps. Then he looked up at the Iron Giant. He stood looking at the tower for a moment, 140 feet of weathered military steel. Rising out of the spruce canopy above the cabin, its presence so established, so continuous, so simply and completely there, that the idea of building a lodge resort around it seemed suddenly like the kind of idea that only makes sense on paper, in a rendering before you stand in the actual place and understand what you are dealing with. The window went up in the silver truck. It backed down the gravel with careful, precise movements that no longer had anything to do with confidence and everything to do with not getting a tire wrong on a mountain road. The sound of the engine diminished. The gravel stopped popping. The forest road took the silver truck away, and Wren stood on the porch of her grandfather's cabin and listened until there was nothing left to hear. Bet climbed the porch steps. "Your father built something 19 years ago," she said, "and never told a soul. He didn't do it to beat anyone. He did it so this would still be here, still be this long after he was gone." She handed Wren the manila envelope. "It's yours now, the land and the reason for it." She picked up her briefcase. She went to her sedan with the knock in the engine and the window she kept cracked, and she drove back down the mountain, and Wren watched her go. Sable was at the edge of the clearing. He had been there since before the truck arrived. He came across the frost-stiff grass and stood beside her on the porch, and they looked at the tower together in the silence left by Dannert's departure. "He's not coming back," Sable said. "No," Wren said. She went inside and sat at the table, and she called her mother. Margaret answered on the third ring with the slightly braced quality of someone who has been waiting for news they expect to be logistical in nature. "I'm not selling," Wren said, not as a prelude to an argument, as a statement of fact delivered with the kind of evenness that indicates the decision is complete. The silence on Margaret's end was the specific silence of someone receiving information that requires a moment of private renegotiation before anything useful can be said. "Wren," she began. "I found his ledgers," Wren said. "Under the floor, 3 of them. 30 years of people who came up here when they had nowhere else to go. 61 letters from people he helped." A pause. "There's an entry about you, from 18 years ago." The silence was different this time, deeper. The silence of someone who has been found in a place they did not know was visible. "He wrote that the lamp was lit for you," Wren said. "He wrote that he kept it lit for his own child most of all." She held the phone and looked at the lamp in the window. "He never stopped. He wrote it in the same ledger as everyone else, the same line at the end." She heard her mother's breathing change. "I think you should come up," Wren said. "Not to see the cabin, not to decide anything, just to see it." A pause. "The door's not locked, Mom." It never was. The silence lasted long enough that Wren began to wonder. Then her mother said in a voice that was doing a great deal of careful work to stay even, "I'll come up." Margaret Calloway arrived 2 days later in her own car, a sensible silver sedan. Nothing like Dannert's, and she parked in the clearing with the deliberateness of someone parking in a place they last left under difficult circumstances and have spent years avoiding. She got out and stood with her keys in her hand and looked at the cabin. Then she looked at the Iron Giant. She looked at it the way you look at something that has appeared in your life, at a scale you were not prepared for, with the slight adjustment of the whole face that happens when the eyes need more room to work. The tower rose out of the spruce with its military patience, its weathered steel the color of old iron at dusk, and Margaret Calloway stood in the clearing of her dead father's property and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Wren stood on the porch and did not hurry this. Sable, with the instinct of someone who understood when a moment belonged to fewer people than were present, had found something to do on the far side of the woodpile. Margaret finally crossed the clearing and climbed the porch steps and stood in front of her daughter and looked at her face for a moment in the assessing way of a mother reading something she is not sure she prepared her child for. Then she went inside. Wren followed. Margaret stood in the center of the main room and turned a slow circle. The stove, the shelves, the table with 2 chairs, the 3 mugs on the kitchen shelf, the coat on the peg by the door. She walked to the coat and stood in front of it and did not touch it for a long moment, and then she pressed her face into it the same way Wren had on the first day, and Wren went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and gave her mother the privacy of not having that moment witnessed. When she came back with 2 cups, Margaret was sitting at the table with her hands flat on the surface, and her jaw set in the way that Wren now understood was the family jaw, the jaw she had apparently inherited. Wren put the ledger on the table. Open to her mother's page. Margaret read it. She read it once, and then she read it again, and her jaw stayed set, and her eyes did not change at their surface, but something shifted in the country behind them, something large and slow, the kind of shift that has been happening for a long time before it becomes visible. She pushed the ledger back across the table without closing it. "I didn't know he wrote these," she said. "I know. I thought—" She stopped. She tried again. "I thought when I left that was it, that there wasn't a way back." She looked at her hands. "Not because he made it that way. I made it that way. I decided the door was locked, and I never checked." Wren said nothing. She had learned from Sable and from the ledgers and from her grandfather's entries that sometimes the most important thing you can do for a person is not fill the silence they need to fill themselves. "He kept a light on," Margaret said. "Not a question, not quite a statement. Something between the two." "Every night for 30 years, Wren said. "I've been keeping it too." Margaret looked at the lamp in the window. It was burning in the afternoon the way it burned at night because Wren had stopped distinguishing, had started leaving it lit whenever she was in the cabin because the lamp in the window was the lamp in the window and she was not going to be the reason it went out. Margaret put her hands around her coffee cup. "He was right," she said quietly. "About the jaw. I have it and so do you, and we've both been using it to keep doors shut that didn't need to be." Wren looked at her mother across the table in the cabin on the mountain and felt something ease that had been held for a long time, not resolved, not repaired, but opened the way a door opens, which is not the same as being fixed, but is the necessary condition for everything that comes after. "Come up and see the tower," Wren said. They climbed the iron giant together in the late afternoon, Margaret going slowly on the stairs, with the careful negotiation of a person reacquainting themselves with heights Wren ahead of her and naming each landing as they came to it. The 3rd landing. "Mind the rail on the right, that section." The 4th. The wind picking up above the tree line, the steel swaying its honest fraction of an inch in the gusts. At the cab, Wren worked the latch and held the door, and her mother stepped inside. Margaret stood in the center of the room on the bolted stool's axis and turned slowly, taking in the fire finder, the binoculars, the logbook, the military maps, the propane heater, the scratched glass of the map table, the stool her father had sat on every clear afternoon for 40 years. Then she saw the drawing. She crossed to it and stood close and read the signature in the careful block letters of a 7-year-old Wren. Age 7. "I sent you up here that summer," Margaret said. "I sent you because I couldn't come myself, and I didn't want you to not know him." She touched the edge of the paper very lightly, not moving it. "I didn't know you drew this." "Neither did I," Wren said. "Not until I came up here." Margaret looked at the drawing on the wall of her father's lookout, and her jaw stayed set, and her eyes stayed dry. And that was the Callaway jaw doing its work, and Wren understood it better now than she ever had, because it was also her jaw, and she was beginning to understand that the jaw was not the problem. The jaw was the thing that kept you moving when moving was the only option. The problem was when you pointed it at a door and decided the door was locked and never checked. The door had not been locked. It had never been locked. They came down from the tower in the last of the afternoon light, and Wren put a meal together in the kitchen, and Sable came in without being invited, and sat at the table, which he had been doing for a week now, and Margaret looked at him across the table with the frank, evaluative gaze of a woman assessing a situation and arriving at a rapid and accurate conclusion. She did not ask him where he came from or what had happened to him before. She asked him how long the firewood would last at this rate, and what the spring situation was like in a hard winter. And he answered both questions with the directness of someone not accustomed to being asked practical questions by adults and finding it unexpectedly comfortable. After dinner, Wren brought out the coffee tin. She set it on the table and took out a selection of the letters and laid them in front of her mother one by one. Not all 61 that would take hours, and was not the point. The point was a few. The woman with the children and the sister in Ohio, the man who had paid it forward 11 times and kept count, the careful handwriting of someone young that said only thank you for not asking me anything. Margaret read them in the order Wren laid them down. She read them without comment, which was the right way to read them, which was the way Wren had read them on the night she understood what they were. When she finished, she set the last one down and looked at the lamp in the window for a long time. "He never told me any of this," she said. "He never told anyone," Wren said. That was the whole of him. Margaret folded the letters along their creases carefully, with the precision of someone returning borrowed things to the condition they were borrowed in. She put them back in the tin. She pressed the lid down. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Stay," Wren said. "Keep the lamp lit. Start a 4th ledger." She looked at Sable, who was looking at the table with the expression of someone listening to something they had not been certain would be said. "The loft's Sable's, as long as he needs it. Asa told him so." Margaret looked at Sable. Sable looked at Margaret with the direct, measuring gaze that was his default form of attention. "Can you run the tower radio?" Margaret said. Sable blinked. "I watched Asa do it. I know the frequencies." "My father ran the weather report at dawn every morning for 40 years, Margaret said. "Even when no one was on duty to hear it. He said a channel ought to have a human voice in case somebody out there needed one." She paused. "It's been 14 months without a voice on that channel." "I know," Sable said. "I've been checking." Something happened in Margaret's face, small, quick, and then gone. But it had been there. Before she left the following morning, she had slept in the loft in the main sleeping space and had not said anything about whether it was comfortable, which meant it probably wasn't, and that was fine. Margaret stood in the clearing and looked at the iron giant one more time in the gray pre-dawn light. The tower rose above her in the cold morning, its steel the deep reddish black of its age, its glass cab catching the first thin light in the east with the same faint flare Wren had seen on the first afternoon. It was simply there, the way things are there, when they have been somewhere long enough that their presence is no longer contingent on any single person's decision to maintain it. "Your grandfather was 40 years old before he understood what this mountain was for," Margaret said. She was talking to the tower as much as to Wren. "He told me once, a long time ago. He said he spent the first 20 years watching for fires, and the second 20 watching for people, and the second 20 were harder and better both. She turned her collar up against the wind. He was wrong about one thing, though. "What's that?" Wren said. He thought it took 40 years to understand it. It didn't take you 22 days. She got in her car and drove down the mountain. Wren stood in the clearing and listened to the engine fade into the trees, and then she stood in the silence that followed and let it be what it was. The wind came off the east ridge with the cold specificity of early morning, and the spruce moved in it, and the iron giant stood in its accustomed place and did not move at all. She started the fourth ledger that evening. She had bought it at Setzer's Hardware in Cairo on a supply run, choosing the one whose cover most closely matched the three. Beneath the floor, dark leather. Softening at the corners, a spine that would hold 30 years of use, if she kept it the way her grandfather had kept his. She brought it home and sat at the table with the lamp in the window, and opened it to the first page. She tucked her grandfather's letter inside the front cover flat against the board, the way he had stored the things that mattered, protected, close, available. She picked up her pen and wrote the date at the top of the first line. Below it, she wrote what she knew. She wrote about a woman who had come up a mountain road with a child asleep on her shoulder and seen a light in a window and stood in the rain wondering if the light was real. She had come 2 nights after Dannert's last visit, in a cold rain off the ridge. Headlights she didn't recognize stopping in the clearing while Wren was banking the stove for the night. A young woman 30, maybe, soaked through a jacket that wasn't equal to a November mountain, holding a sleeping child against her shoulder, with the particular containment of someone who has been holding something precious together through force of will for longer than she should have had to. She had looked at the cabin and the lamp and at Wren in the doorway, and she had said, "I saw the light. I'm sorry. I can go." "You can't go," Wren had said. "It's coming down too hard and that boy's asleep. Come in. There's a fire and there's food. The loft's made up." Why, the woman had said, and Wren had smiled, because the question was the same question, the eternal question. The question that 61 letters and 3 ledgers and a lamp in a window for 30 years had been answering all along. "My grandfather," she had said, "come inside." She wrote all of it in her grandfather's ledger in her own hand, which slanted slightly uphill the way his had, which she had not noticed until she saw them on the same page. At the end of the entry, she wrote the only line that mattered, the line that had been written 200 times in 3 books before this one, and would be written again as many times as there was someone to write it and someone who needed it to be true. "The lamp stays lit. The door's not locked. Told her she could come back." Sable read it over her shoulder. He had come down from the loft without the sound that usually announced his descent quietly enough that she hadn't heard him, and he had been standing behind her for some time. He would not have done that a month ago. He was doing it now. "He would have liked that you kept it the same," he said. "He would have liked that you stayed," Wren said. Sable was quiet for a moment, the particular quality of quiet he produced when something had arrived at a place he didn't have a ready response to. Then he went to the kitchen and poured himself coffee and sat across from her at the table, and she closed the ledger, and they sat together in the lamplight without the need to fill it. Outside, the mountain was in the middle of its night. The wind had dropped. The spruce stood still for once. Above the clearing, the iron giant rose into the dark, its form invisible in the moonless night, except as an absence of stars in the shape of a tower, and at its top the glass cab was dark, and below it the cabin window threw its small yellow light out across the clearing, and into the trees, and down the mountain to where the forest road descended toward whatever was coming up it. Wren was 22 years old. She had a truck with more miles on it than she could account for a part-time job at Setzer's Hardware she had arranged by phone last week, a boy in the loft who had started running the tower radio at dawn every morning in a slow, flat voice, even when no one was on duty to hear it, and a mountain that could never be taken. She had a tin full of 62 letters now, and a new ledger with 2 entries in it, and a letter in the inside pocket of her jacket that she was the only one who would ever read. She had a lamp in the window that had not gone out. She left it burning when she climbed to the loft. She left it burning the way it had been burning when she found it, and the way it had been burning for 30 years before that, and the way it would go on burning on the worst nights, and the ordinary nights, and all the nights in between, for everyone on the mountain road who was walking towards something they hadn't been promised, but needed to find. Because that was what the light was for. Not for the night when someone came, for all the nights they didn't, so it would already be burning on the one night they did. The road came up to the door, and the door was not locked, and the lamp was in the window, small and steady and certain, and Wren Calloway, who had driven up a mountain to close a door, and had found instead that the door had never been closed at all, sat in her grandfather's tower, and watched over his 100 square miles of dark, and understood at last that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and had only just begun.